1945, British North Borneo. In the closing months of the Second World War, the island of Borneo became the stage for one of the most harrowing atrocities ever committed in the Pacific. What began as a Japanese prisoner-of-war camp in the remote town of Sandakan would end as a nightmare of starvation, disease, and unimaginable cruelty. Historians would later call it the Sandakan Death Marches, a tragedy where over 2,000 Allied prisoners were forced to walk into oblivion. The story begins 3 years earlier, in 1942, when British and Australian troops, captured after the fall of Singapore, were shipped to the northern coast of Borneo. The Japanese needed labor to construct an airfield that could support their war effort against advancing Allied forces. Sandakan, surrounded by dense rainforest and rugged mountains, was chosen as the site. At first glance, it seemed a place of strategic value, but for the men who arrived there, it would become a slow descent into hell. The prisoners of war, mostly Australians from the 8th Division, were promised humane treatment under the Geneva Convention. Instead, they found themselves stripped of their rights, dignity, and basic humanity. The Japanese Kempeitai, their military police, ruled with an iron fist. Every mistake was punished by beatings, confinement, or death. The men were forced to work long hours under the sweltering tropical sun, clearing land, hauling logs, and constructing runways out of mud and stone. Malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition spread like wildfire through the camp. Medical supplies were non-existent. Even the sick and dying were forced to labor. By late 1944, the tide of war had turned. The Allies were advancing across the Pacific, and Japanese command in Borneo knew their position was becoming untenable. Sandakan's airfield was destroyed by repeated Allied bombings, rendering it useless. Food was running low. The Japanese, fearing that the prisoners might be liberated, decided to evacuate them inland, across 260 kilometers of unforgiving jungle terrain, to the town of Ranau, near the western coast. They called it a relocation. In truth, it was a death sentence. On January 29, 1945, the first group of around 455 prisoners set out from Sandakan. They were barely alive, skeletal, weak, many with open sores and infections from insect bites and tropical ulcers. Each man carried a small bundle of rice, a cooking tin, and whatever remnants of clothing he had left. The guards, armed and well-fed, followed close behind. Anyone who stumbled or lagged behind was beaten, bayoneted, or shot. The march wound through dense jungle, across rivers, over steep ridges, and through knee-deep mud. The path was nearly impassable even for healthy men. For these starving skeletons, it was a journey into the grave. The second group left Sandakan a month later. By then, the camp had been reduced to chaos. Those too sick to walk were left behind, often without food or water. Many of them were executed in their huts as the Japanese prepared to abandon the site. Witnesses later described the camp as a wasteland of death. Bodies unburied, huts collapsing, the smell of decay hanging in the humid air. For the prisoners still able to stand, the only way forward was west, toward Ranau and toward death. Survivors' accounts describe how the prisoners tried to help each other, sharing scraps of rice, whispering encouragement, and carrying the weakest among them. But the jungle took its toll. Leeches, mosquitoes, and exhaustion wore them down. Rain fell constantly, and their clothes rotted on their backs. They slept on the wet ground, exposed to the cold nights and the constant fear of punishment. When men fell behind, the guards made an example of them, forcing others to watch as they were executed on the side of the trail. Local villagers along the route witnessed the columns of prisoners passing by, silent, ghost-like figures barely able to walk. Some civilians, risking their own lives, tried to sneak food and water to the men. A few even helped the most desperate escape into the jungle, but the vast majority never made it. Disease and starvation thinned their numbers daily. By the time the first group reached Ranau in February, fewer than half were still alive. The second and third groups that followed would suffer the same fate. Back at Sandakan, around 300 prisoners were left behind. Most were too ill to move. In May 1945, when the final group departed, Japanese soldiers began methodically killing those who remained, shooting them in small batches or leaving them to die from hunger. When Australian troops later discovered the camp after Japan's surrender, they found evidence of executions, mass graves and piles of bones scattered among the ruins. Out of more than 2,400 Allied prisoners who had entered Sandakan since 1942, only 6 would survive the ordeal, all Australians who had managed to escape and were later rescued by local villagers and guerrillas. For decades after the war, the full truth of what happened at Sandakan remained buried under official silence. Many documents were destroyed and few witnesses survived. But the testimony of those 6 survivors, together with local accounts, would eventually expose the horror of the marches. The story they told was not one of battle, but of endurance, betrayal, and unimaginable cruelty. What makes the Sandakan tragedy stand out is not just its scale, but its utter futility. The prisoners were marched to Ranau not for strategic reasons, but out of a collapsing army's paranoia and cruelty. There was no need to move them. There was no plan for their survival. It was a senseless act of destruction carried out in the final, desperate months of Japan's occupation of Borneo. As Allied planes roared overhead and liberation grew near, the men of Sandakan vanished into the jungle, their names erased by disease, starvation, and silence. Today, their story stands as one of the darkest episodes in the Pacific War, a grim reminder of the price of human cruelty and the strength of those who endured it until their last breath. Before the death marches began, Sandakan was already a slow-motion tragedy. From 1942 onward, it functioned as both a labor camp and an airfield construction site under the Imperial Japanese Army's 8th Division. On paper, it was designated as Prisoner of War Camp No. 2, Sandakan. In reality, it was a place where starvation and disease became weapons of control. The first Allied prisoners, mostly Australians from the 8th Division, captured after the fall of Singapore, arrived in Borneo in July 1942. They were joined by smaller contingents of British troops taken in Java and other islands. Their total number would rise to more than 2,400 men. They were marched through the sweltering coastal jungle to a site on the edge of Sandakan town, surrounded by mangrove swamps and thick rainforest. Their guards built watchtowers, fences of sharpened bamboo, and a series of long barracks made of palm timber and atap leaves. From there, the men could see the coastline, but freedom might as well have been a world away. Every day before dawn, hundreds of prisoners were marched out in work gangs to clear jungle and build the airfield for the Japanese 37th Army. The site was meant to be a staging ground for air operations across the South China Sea. Under constant supervision and beatings, the men hacked at red clay with shovels, carried logs on their shoulders, and laid down gravel by hand. Allied aircraft soon discovered the site and began bombing raids. Several prisoners were killed in those attacks, not by the enemy they once fought, but by the bombs of their own side trying to destroy what they were forced to build. Supplies were scarce and rations were meager. Each man received a handful of rice a day, sometimes with dried fish or jungle greens. Malaria, beriberi, and dysentery spread uncontrollably. The camp's Japanese medical officer kept medicine for his own troops. By mid-1943, most prisoners had lost half their body weight. The airfield was completed that same year, a runway carved from the earth by dying men. But by late 1944, Allied bombing rendered it useless. The effort and the lives spent building it had been for nothing. The Japanese commandant, Captain Susumi Hoshijima, enforced discipline through violence. His guards, many from the Formosan, Taiwanese auxiliary units, were notorious for brutality. Prisoners were beaten for speaking without permission, for failing to bow, even for looking at guards the wrong way. The Kempeitai, Japan's military police, ran periodic purges for supposed escape plots. Men were tortured, executed, and buried in unmarked graves around the camp perimeter. Survivors would later testify that after 1943, Sandakan no longer felt like a camp. It felt like a slow extermination. Despite the horror, the prisoners tried to preserve fragments of humanity. They held whispered services at night, carved wooden crosses, and wrote letters they would never send. Some secretly built a radio to listen to news of the war. When word spread that Allied forces were advancing across the Pacific, retaking the Philippines and moving closer to Borneo, hope flickered. But hope, at Sandakan, came with danger. Anyone caught with a radio faced execution. In 1944, the Japanese discovered the secret set hidden under a barrack floor. The punishment was swift. The prisoners involved were tortured for weeks and then publicly executed. The morale of the camp broke. By the end of 1944, the situation for the Japanese garrison itself was deteriorating. Allied bombers had cut off supply lines, and starvation began to affect the guards as well. Yet even in their own desperation, they tightened control rather than eased it. Prisoners too weak to work were denied food altogether. Records show that by December 1944, over 1,000 men at Sandakan were already dead. The remaining survivors, emaciated and skeletal, were barely capable of standing, let alone marching. In January 1945, with the Allies pushing into Borneo and the Japanese fearing invasion from the east, orders came from headquarters in Jesselton: evacuate all able-bodied prisoners inland to Ranau. It was supposed to be a relocation to prevent Allied rescue. In reality, it marked the beginning of the end. On the morning of January 29th, the first column assembled inside the camp compound. Around 450 prisoners, guarded by 50 Japanese soldiers and a detachment of Formosan auxiliaries, were lined up and ordered to move out. Each carried 10 days of rice, a few utensils, and a single blanket. No carts, no medical support, no food depots awaited them. The trail westward led into the dense interior of North Borneo, a region few outsiders had ever crossed. Even Japanese troops struggled in those conditions. For the prisoners, it was an impossible journey. Inside the camp, those left behind could only watch the column vanish through the gate. They knew what awaited them. Within weeks, their own names would be called. The Japanese prepared the second and third groups in February and May, each smaller, each composed of men in worse condition. Those too sick to move were left in the barracks, denied food and later executed one by one. The camp that had once held thousands now echoed with silence and the sound of the jungle reclaiming it. For the men on the trail, survival depended on sheer will and the mercy of the jungle. The road to Ranau cut through swamps, steep ridges and rivers swollen by monsoon rains. They had to wade through mud up to their knees, often barefoot. Locals along the route, Dusun and Murut villagers, risked death by leaving fruit or water beside the path. Some even guided escapees into the forest. But for most, there was no escape. Those who fell were shot, their bodies left where they lay. Disease and hunger followed them like shadows. Back in Sandakan, Captain Hoshijima wrote in his logbook that the evacuation was proceeding according to plan. But there was no plan. There was only death. When the last group left in May 1945, fewer than 600 prisoners remained alive. By August, Japan had surrendered. Of the thousands taken to Sandakan, none of the British and only 6 Australians would live to tell what happened, each surviving only by fleeing into the jungle and being hidden by local people who defied the occupiers. The death marches had begun, but the full horror was still to come. The path to Ranau would soon become one of the most infamous trails in the history of war, a place where humanity collapsed under hunger, cruelty, and fear. The first march from Sandakan to Ranau began at dawn on January 29, 1945. A line of 455 Allied prisoners, mostly Australian, some British, stumbled through the gates of the Sandakan camp, barefoot, weak, and carrying the bare minimum. Behind them marched Japanese guards, rifles slung over their shoulders, bayonets gleaming in the early light. None of the prisoners could have known that almost every man in that column would be dead within a few months. The route stretched more than 260 kilometers through the interior of North Borneo. It wound westward across rivers, swamps, and mountains that rose nearly 5,000 feet above sea level. The trail, little more than a narrow jungle track, was plagued by leeches, mudslides, and torrential rain. The Japanese called it the Ranau track, but for the prisoners, it would become known as the Road of Death. Eyewitness accounts from the 6 surviving Australians describe the same nightmare conditions. Each man was given just 2 days' worth of rice for a journey expected to take several weeks. There were no pack animals, no medical units, and no supply posts. The men wore rags instead of uniforms, their bodies little more than bone and skin. Many were barefoot, the soles of their feet torn by roots and stones. If anyone fell, he was beaten with bamboo poles or bayoneted on the spot. The guards made no distinction between illness and disobedience. Falling behind was death. By the 5th day, the column had already begun to thin. Malaria, dysentery, and sheer exhaustion took hold. The humid air choked every breath, and the thick jungle canopy turned daylight into a dim green twilight. Prisoners stumbled forward in silence, their heads bowed, carrying cooking tins and rice sacks that grew lighter as the days passed. Some were seen collapsing into the mud and never getting up again. Those who survived long enough to see dusk slept on the open ground, soaked to the bone without fires or shelter. The Japanese forbade them from resting more than a few hours. When dawn came, they were kicked awake and forced onward. Local villagers along the trail began noticing the strange processions, lines of emaciated men moving like ghosts through the forest, guarded by Japanese soldiers. Some villagers risked their lives to help, sneaking out at night to leave bananas or coconuts near the track. Others, terrified of punishment, could only watch from a distance. One witness later recalled seeing prisoners so weak they crawled on hands and knees, their eyes hollow and their lips cracked from dehydration. It was said the jungle itself seemed to swallow them. By mid-February, the first group finally reached Ranau, though arrival is hardly the word. Out of the original 455 who had left Sandakan, fewer than 200 were still alive. Those who made it were barely conscious. They were herded into a crude new camp near the village, a clearing of bamboo huts surrounded by a single wire fence. There was no food, no medicine, and no supplies waiting for them. The Japanese guards had no plan beyond containment. The prisoners were ordered to build huts, dig trenches, and collect firewood, all with what little strength they had left. When the second march began in May 1945, it was even worse. This time, about 536 men were sent out, many so weak they could not stand without help. The Japanese commander at Sandakan, Captain Hoshijima, insisted the move was temporary relocation. But even the guards knew it was a death order. The route was the same, but by then the wet season had returned. Rivers had overflowed, turning the track into knee-deep muck. The men were given almost no food. Some ate snails, leaves, or whatever they could find. Each step forward came at the price of another life. Survivors' testimonies paint a chilling picture of the trail's final days. At Paginatan, a small settlement halfway to Ranau, villagers later found dozens of unburied bodies along the path, men who had collapsed and been shot where they fell. Some had their hands still clutching their cooking tins. Others were found bound, showing signs of execution. When Allied investigators retraced the route after the war, they found shallow graves scattered every few hundred meters, each one marked by a simple cross or bamboo stick placed by sympathetic locals. Those who reached Ranau alive soon faced conditions worse than the march itself. The surviving prisoners, now numbering fewer than 200 combined from all groups, were put to work carrying sacks of rice for the Japanese army. They were forced to transport supplies for soldiers retreating through the mountains, even though they could barely walk. When their bodies finally gave out, the guards simply executed them. There was no burial detail, no ceremony, just another life erased in the mud. Meanwhile, back in Sandakan, the remaining prisoners, around 300 too ill to walk, were being exterminated. By June, Japanese troops began systematically shooting or starving them to death. By August 15th, when Japan finally surrendered, every British prisoner and nearly all Australians were dead. Only 6 men would ever walk out of that jungle alive, all Australians, all escapees who fled during the marches and were rescued by local villagers. Their testimonies later formed the foundation of Australia's post-war war crimes investigations. They described scenes of starvation so severe that men resorted to eating grass and bark, of guards killing prisoners for stealing a handful of rice, and of nights so cold and wet that they slept beside the bodies of their dead comrades for warmth. The Sandakan Death Marches were not a military operation, they were a systematic extermination through neglect and cruelty. By the end of the war, more than 2,400 Allied prisoners of war had perished in Borneo. None of the British survived. The few who escaped did so by crawling through the jungle, hiding in villages and depending on the courage of local people who risked everything to help them. Years later, Investigators would trace the entire 260-kilometer route from Sandakan to Ranau, marking each grave and collecting what evidence remained. The trail was lined with bones, spent bullet casings, and fragments of clothing. It told the story that words could never fully capture, of men who were marched into the jungle to die, and of the cruelty that tried to erase them. The Sandakan Marches remain one of the darkest episodes in Australian military history, not only because of the loss of life, but because almost no one survived to tell it. What happened next in Ranau, in the final weeks before Japan's surrender, would reveal the full extent of the horror. By June 1945, the war in the Pacific was nearing its end. Allied bombers roamed the skies over Borneo, cutting off Japanese supply routes and isolating their scattered garrisons. But deep in the jungle, in the hills around Ranau, hundreds of Australian prisoners were still being worked, starved and beaten to death. The men who survived the second march had arrived at Ranau in May, fewer than half of those who left Sandakan. They found nothing waiting for them. The Japanese had built no proper camp, no kitchen, no hospital. The prisoners were forced to construct their own shelters from bamboo and palm leaves, hacking at the jungle with hands that could barely lift a shovel. They were given only a handful of rice each day, sometimes mixed with weeds or rotting vegetables. Dysentery, malaria and beriberi tore through the group. The men's bodies swelled from malnutrition, their skin split, and their legs were covered in ulcers that refused to heal. Those too sick to stand were left to die in the mud. The Japanese guards at Ranau were under orders to keep the prisoners working. They were forced to carry 20-kilogram sacks of rice for the Japanese troops retreating west. Each journey up and down the hilly terrain cost lives. When men collapsed under the weight, they were shot where they lay. There was no burial detail, only shallow graves dug by those still alive. By July, only a few dozen men remained. Survivors' testimonies describe a nightmare that had gone beyond reason. Prisoners were so starved that they ate grass, bark, and their own leather belts. One escapee, Corporal Keith Botterill, later recalled seeing a man scrape maggots off a corpse to eat them for protein. Botterill himself weighed less than 40 kilograms when he was rescued months later. "We weren't men anymore," he said. "We were ghosts walking in daylight." Meanwhile, back at Sandakan, those who had been left behind met their end. The Japanese had burned the camp to the ground in June 1945. Most of the remaining prisoners, around 250 men, were executed or starved to death before the Japanese withdrew. When Australian forces arrived after the war, they found the ground littered with bones, personal effects, and the ruins of huts. The Sandakan camp had ceased to exist, consumed by jungle and silence. In Ranau, the Japanese commander, Captain Takakuwa Takuo, issued new orders in late July. As Allied troops landed on the west coast of Borneo and began pushing inland, he was told to eliminate the remaining prisoners. The guards began executing those too weak to move one by one, often under the pretext of evacuation. Some were marched a few hundred meters into the jungle, told to dig holes, and then shot. By the beginning of August, fewer than 15 Allied prisoners were still alive. The end of the war was only days away. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. On August 9th, Nagasaki followed. But in the hills of Ranau, the prisoners had no way of knowing. The Japanese guards continued their killings even after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15th. Historians later confirmed that the last execution of prisoners at Ranau occurred on August 27, 1945, 12 days after the war was officially over. Only 6 men managed to escape the Sandakan-Ranau marches, all of them Australians. Among them were Private Nelson Short, Lance Bombardier William Stickpewich, and Gunner Owen Campbell, names that would later become the only living voices of more than 2,000 dead. Each had fled during the marches or slipped away near Ranau with the help of local villagers. They were hidden in jungle huts fed by native families and eventually rescued by Australian units or local guerrillas fighting under Allied command. Their testimonies, recorded after the war, were harrowing. They described prisoners reduced to skeletons, guards who laughed as they beat dying men, and a trail so thick with corpses that it became impossible to count them. One survivor said, "You could walk for a mile and never be out of sight of a body." Another remembered the rain, constant, unrelenting, and the sound of boots sinking into mud mixed with blood. "The jungle swallowed them," he said, and then forgot. When the Allied investigation teams reached Ranau in October 1945, they found the remnants of the camp, a few broken bamboo huts, piles of bones, and personal belongings scattered across the clearing. There were no living prisoners left. War crimes investigators from the Australian Army catalogued the remains, mapped the trail, and took testimonies from local witnesses. The evidence confirmed what the survivors had said. Prisoners had been systematically starved, beaten, and executed under direct orders from Japanese command. Captain Hoshijima, the Sandakan camp commandant, was later tried by an Australian military tribunal in Rabaul. He was found guilty of war crimes and executed by hanging in 1946. Several of his officers and guards met the same fate. But for many Australians, justice did little to ease the weight of what happened. The scale of the atrocity, the deliberate destruction of 2,400 men, was almost beyond comprehension. Even within Japan's own military circles, Sandakan became a symbol of moral collapse. Documents recovered after the war showed that senior officers had received reports about the prisoners' condition, but took no action. The official response was to let nature take its course, and nature in Borneo's jungle meant disease, starvation, and death. The tragedy of Sandakan lay not only in the suffering, but in the silence that followed. For years after the war, few Australians even knew the full story. Many families were told their sons had simply died in captivity. It wasn't until survivors began to speak publicly in the late 1940s that the truth emerged. Their accounts shocked a nation still coming to terms with the Pacific War. By the time the Allied recovery teams completed their work in 1946, they had exhumed over 1,400 bodies from the route between Sandakan and Ranau. Hundreds more were never found, lost forever in the rainforest. Each grave told the same story. A soldier, far from home, dying of starvation and exhaustion on a march that never should have happened. The Sandakan Death Marches were not a tragedy of war. They were a crime of intent, a deliberate act of extermination carried out by men who knew the war was already lost. And as investigators pieced together the final weeks at Ranau, one question remained: how could such suffering have been hidden for so long? When the war finally ended in August 1945, few in Australia knew what had really happened in Borneo. Families waited for news of fathers, sons, and brothers who had been reported missing since the fall of Singapore. Official telegrams would soon arrive, each carrying the same message: died while a prisoner of war. But the details were absent. The true story of the Sandakan Death Marches was still buried in the jungle. In late 1945, Australian and British recovery teams began their grim search. Guided by local villagers who had witnessed the marches, they retraced the entire 260-kilometer trail from Sandakan to Ranau. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The path was lined with shallow graves, sometimes just a few bamboo crosses or scraps of clothing. The teams uncovered skeletal remains still bound with rope, bullet casings scattered nearby, and cooking tins engraved with soldiers' initials. At the site of the Ranau camp, the ground was littered with bones. Out of more than 2,400 prisoners who had entered Sandakan between 1942 and 1945, only 6 men were found alive. Every British soldier was dead. Those 6 Australian survivors were immediately flown to Australia for medical treatment and debriefing. Their testimonies shocked military investigators. They described a system of calculated starvation, mass executions, and forced marches that were never meant to succeed. Captain Susumi Hoshijima, the Sandakan camp commandant, and Captain Takakua Takuo, the officer at Ranau, were arrested and tried for war crimes before Australian tribunals in Rabaul. Hoshijima was found guilty and executed by hanging on April 6, 1946. Takakua and several others were also sentenced to death. Dozens of lower-ranking guards received long prison terms. The trials established an undeniable truth. The Sandakan Death Marches were not an accident of war, but a deliberate act of cruelty carried out under orders. The Japanese officers had known the prisoners would not survive the journey. Their intent, as the prosecutors argued, was to destroy them by neglect. Despite the trials, the story of Sandakan quickly faded from public consciousness. Post-war Australia was rebuilding. Veterans were returning home from the Middle East, New Guinea, and Europe. The scale of global suffering overshadowed the horror of one remote jungle tragedy. For decades, Sandakan was mentioned only in military records and war crimes documents. Many families of the dead received no explanation beyond "died in Borneo." It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that researchers and historians began to revisit the story. Australian journalist Lynette Silver and former servicemen travelled to Sabah to locate the original route of the death marches. Local villagers guided them along overgrown trails, showing where the prisoners had fallen. In time, monuments were erected at both Sandakan and Ranau. The Sandakan Memorial Park, built on the site of the original camp, now stands as a place of remembrance, a quiet garden where the jungle once hid mass graves. At its center, a single plaque reads, "They died that others might live." Every year on August 15th, the anniversary of Japan's surrender, Australian and Malaysian officials hold a memorial service at the site. Survivors' families, local residents and veterans gather to read the names of the fallen. For most, those names are all that remain. No bodies, no graves, only the memory of the men who never came home. In Malaysia, villagers still tell stories passed down from their grandparents, of starving men walking barefoot through the rain, of secret food left on trails at night, of the Japanese who threatened entire families for helping prisoners. Many of those villagers were later honoured by the Australian government for their bravery. Without them, even the 6 survivors might not have lived to tell the story. For historians, the Sandakan Death Marches stand as one of the most brutal examples of Japan's treatment of Allied prisoners during World War II, on a scale comparable to the Bataan Death March in the Philippines. But Sandakan was even more lethal. At Bataan, thousands died. At Sandakan, only 6 survived. The story also forced Australia to confront the hidden cost of war. When the survivors gave testimony, many spoke not of anger but of remembrance. Gunner Owen Campbell once said, "We don't want revenge, we just want people to know what happened." His words became the unofficial motto of the Sandakan memorials. Today, the remnants of the route from Sandakan to Ranau have been mapped and preserved as part of historical heritage trails. Travellers can walk sections of it, guided by plaques and markers that describe what happened on those same paths 80 years ago. The jungle has reclaimed much of the land, but under its canopy, traces of the past remain. Rusted canteens, bullets, fragments of boots. They are silent witnesses to a crime that nearly disappeared from memory. The Sandakan story is not just a record of cruelty, it is a testament to endurance, to the men who faced unimaginable suffering and to the locals who risked everything to save them. It reminds us how thin the line can be between civilization and barbarity, how war erases humanity, and how memory, even when buried, can be uncovered again. 80 years later, the name Sandakan still carries the weight of 2,400 souls. Their voices are gone, but their story endures, whispered by the wind that moves through the jungle and by those who refuse to let it be forgotten.